June 2024, the day Venezuela poked the bear and got its claws clipped. Let me tell you about the moment that should have set off alarm bells in every strategic studies department from Washington to Beijing, but didn't. On the morning of June 19, the Venezuelan Navy, under direct orders from Nicolas Maduro, intercepted and attempted to board a commercial vessel in international waters. Not just any, the Essequibo Explorer, a Armenian flagged ship under contract to ExxonMobil, conducting seismic surveys in a disputed maritime zone claimed by both Venezuela and Guyana. The Venezuelan patrol boat Naiguata, yes, the same one that sank in 2020 after ramming a cruise ship, approached with weapons manned, demanding the ship halt its operations. What happened next wasn't just a minor diplomatic incident. It was a deliberate, calculated test of American naval resolve in the Caribbean, and the response was a masterclass in how great powers enforce red lines without firing a shot. Now, if you've been following the headlines, you've probably seen the sanitized Venezuela challenges U.S. over Guyana dispute, tensions rise. The State Department issued a stern statement. The Pentagon sent a destroyer to shadow the Venezuelan fleet. The media moved on after a day or two, because let's face it, another Latin American crisis doesn't sell ads like a TikTok scandal or a celebrity meltdown. But here's the thing, I've spent the last 3 decades studying how great powers react when their authority is tested, and what just happened in the Caribbean isn't a footnote. It's a case study in how the United States still enforces its hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, even as the world moves toward multipolarity. And Venezuela's miscalculation reveals something far more dangerous than a single fail. It exposes the brittle, reactive nature of American power in an era when Washington can no longer afford to ignore challenges in its own backyard. But before we get into what this really means, let's start with the official story, the one they want you to believe. The official: a routine dispute, a measured response. According to the U.S. government, this was a straightforward case of Venezuelan aggression in a long-running territorial dispute. Guyana, a former British colony, has controlled the Essequibo region, a swath of jungle and offshore oil fields roughly the size of Florida, since the 19th century. Venezuela has claimed it for just as long, but in 2015, ExxonMobil discovered massive oil reserves off Guyana's coast, turning a sleepy border dispute into a geopolitical flashpoint. When the Essequibo Explorer began surveying those waters in June, Venezuela sent its navy to assert its claim, leading to the standoff. The U.S. response was swift but measured. The State Department condemned Venezuela's actions as provocative and illegal. The Pentagon dispatched the USS Nitsa, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, to conduct freedom of navigation operations in the area. The Coast Guard issued a warning to commercial vessels about operating in disputed waters. And that, according to the official line, was that. No shots fired. No escalation. Just a reminder that the U.S. still polices the Caribbean, and Venezuela would do well not to test its patience. The media largely echoed this narrative. The New York Times ran a piece titled "U.S. Navy Shadows Venezuelan Ships After Guyana Standoff," framing it as a minor flare-up in a regional spat. CNN quoted a Pentagon official saying, "We're monitoring the situation, but there's no indication this will escalate." Even the more hawkish outlets like the Washington Post treated it as a footnote, buried beneath coverage of Ukraine and Taiwan. The message was this was business as usual. Venezuela blustered, the U.S. flexed, and everyone moved on. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not wrong, exactly, just dangerously incomplete. Because what the official story leaves out is the why. Why did Venezuela choose this moment to provoke the U.S.? Why did Maduro, a man who has spent the last decade desperately trying to avoid direct confrontation with Washington, suddenly decide to play chicken with an American destroyer? And most importantly, why did the U.S. respond the way it did, not with a single ship, but with a coordinated show of force that included not just the Nitsa, but also a P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft, a Coast Guard cutter, and, according to some reports, a nuclear-powered submarine lurking in the deep? The answer isn't just about Guyana. It's about China. It's about Russia. It's about the slow, grinding collapse of American unipolarity in the Western Hemisphere. And it's about what happens when a declining hegemon is forced to draw a line in the sand, because if it doesn't, the whole edifice starts to crumble. Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. Let's start with the most glaring: Venezuela didn't act alone. In the weeks leading up to the standoff, Maduro made two high-profile visits, one to Beijing, where he secured a $5 billion investment package, and another to Moscow, where he met with Vladimir Putin and signed a series of military cooperation agreements. The timing wasn't coincidental. China has been quietly extending its influence in Latin America for years, but its recent push into Guyana's oil sector has been particularly aggressive. Chinese state-owned firms now control nearly 40% of Guyana's offshore blocks, and Beijing has been pressuring Georgetown to resist U.S. pressure to diversify its partnerships. Meanwhile, Russia has been arming Venezuela for over a decade, supplying everything from Kalashnikovs to Su-30 fighter jets. When Maduro ordered his navy to intercept the Essequibo Explorer, he wasn't just acting on his own, he was testing how far he could push with the backing of two great powers that have a vested interest in seeing the U.S. humiliated in its own neighborhood. Now, here's where the official narrative starts to unravel. The U.S. government would have you believe that this was a spontaneous act of Venezuelan aggression. But the data doesn't support that. Satellite imagery from the days leading up to the incident shows a significant buildup of Venezuelan naval assets in the area, far more than would be needed for a routine patrol. Intelligence sources I've spoken to confirm that the Naiguata wasn't just out for a joyride, it was part of a coordinated exercise with Russian naval advisors, who have been embedded with the Venezuelan fleet since 2019. This wasn't a rogue operation. It was a calculated provocation, designed to see how the U.S. would react to a direct challenge in what Washington has long considered its exclusive sphere of influence. And react it did, but not in the way Venezuela expected. The U.S. response wasn't just about sending a destroyer. It was a full-spectrum demonstration of American power, designed to send a message not just to Caracas, but to Beijing and Moscow. The Nitsa wasn't alone. The P-8 Poseidon, a maritime patrol aircraft with advanced surveillance capabilities, was overhead within hours, tracking every move the Venezuelan fleet made. The Coast Guard cutter Stone was deployed to escort commercial vessels through the disputed zone. And then there's the submarine unnamed, unconfirmed, but almost certainly there. U.S. attack submarines don't just happen to be in the Caribbean. They're sent when Washington wants to remind adversaries that it can strike without warning, without detection, and without mercy. What's really happening here is a game of great power brinkmanship, and Venezuela is the pawn. Maduro thought he could play the U.S. off against China and Russia, using the Essequibo dispute as leverage to extract concessions. Instead, he walked right into a trap. The U.S. didn't just respond to the provocation, it used it as an opportunity to reassert its dominance in the region, sending a message to Beijing and Moscow that the Monroe Doctrine isn't dead, no matter how many times they try to bury it. But here's the Venezuela's miscalculation wasn't just about overestimating its own strength. It was about underestimating how desperate the U.S. has become to maintain its hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. And that desperation is the most dangerous part of this story. The broader geopolitical why this isn't just about Guyana. This isn't just about a few square miles of jungle or a handful of oil wells. This is about the future of American power in the 21st century. For the last 3 decades, the United States has operated under the assumption that it can maintain its global dominance without serious challenge. That assumption is now in tatters. China is rising. Russia is resurgent. And in Latin America, a region Washington has long treated as its backyard, both Beijing and Moscow are making inroads that would have been unthinkable during the Cold War. The Essequibo dispute is just the latest front in this struggle. China has been quietly buying up Latin America's resources for years, from copper in Chile to soybeans in Brazil. But its recent push into Guyana's oil sector is different. Guyana is set to become the world's fastest-growing economy, thanks to its offshore reserves, and China wants a piece of the action. Beijing has already loaned Guyana billions for infrastructure projects, and its state-owned firms are now the largest foreign investors in the country's energy sector. The message is if the U.S. won't invest in Latin America, China will. Russia, meanwhile, has been playing a different game. While China focuses on economics, Moscow is focused on military influence. Venezuela is Russia's most important ally in the Western Hemisphere, and Putin has gone to great lengths to keep Maduro in power. Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group have been spotted in Venezuela. Russian military advisors train the Venezuelan armed forces. And in 2019, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of force that sent shockwaves through Washington. The message? If the US can arm Ukraine and Taiwan, Russia can arm Venezuela. This is the new Cold War, and Latin America is the battleground. The US has long seen the Western Hemisphere as its exclusive sphere of influence, but that monopoly is eroding. China and Russia aren't just challenging American power, they're actively working to replace it. And that's why Venezuela's provocation was so dangerous. It wasn't just a test of US naval power. It was a test of whether Washington still has the will to enforce its red lines in its own backyard. The US response was a resounding yes, but at what cost? Military and strategic, the illusion of a quick and easy victory. Now, let's talk about the military dimension of this crisis, because this is where things get really dangerous. The US has a long history of underestimating the costs of military intervention, and Venezuela is no exception. If you listen to the hawks in Washington, toppling Maduro would be a cakewalk. We've got the best military in the world, they say. Venezuela's armed forces are a joke. One cruise missile, and it's over. I've heard this before. I heard it about Iraq. I heard it about Afghanistan. I heard it about Libya. And I'm here to tell it's nonsense. Venezuela's military may be corrupt and poorly equipped, but it's not powerless. The country has over 100,000 active duty troops, thousands of Russian-made tanks, and a stockpile of surface-to-air missiles that could make life very difficult for US aircraft. More importantly, Venezuela has a well-armed population. The country has the highest per capita gun ownership rate in Latin America, and Maduro's regime has spent years arming civilian militias. If the US were to launch a full-scale invasion, it wouldn't just be fighting the Venezuelan military, it would be fighting a nation in arms. And then there's the Russian factor. Moscow has made it clear that it will defend Venezuela if the US attacks. In 2019, after the US recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, Russia sent 2 Tu-160 bombers to Caracas in a show of support. Those bombers weren't just for show, they were a warning. If the US invades Venezuela, Russia will respond. How? We don't know. But in a world where great powers are once again playing for keeps, the risk of escalation is very real. The US has already seen what happens when it underestimates the costs of intervention. Iraq and Afghanistan cost trillions of dollars and thousands of lives, and for what? Libya is a failed state. Syria is a quagmire. The lesson should be military power is not a magic wand. It's a tool, and like any tool, it can be misused. Venezuela is not Iraq. It's not Afghanistan. It's a sovereign nation with powerful allies, and any US intervention would be a gamble with no guaranteed payoff. The hawks in Washington need to understand that. Because if they don't, we could be looking at another forever war, and this time, it could be right on America's doorstep. The domestic political why this is about more than just Venezuela. Here's where things get really interesting. Because this isn't just about geopolitics. It's about domestic politics, and the incentives that drive American foreign policy are often just as dangerous as the threats abroad. Let's start with the 2024 is an election year. And in an election year, foreign policy becomes a political weapon. The Biden administration has been under fire from Republicans for being weak on Venezuela. Marco Rubio has been hammering the White House for months, accusing it of allowing Maduro to get away with murder. Ted Cruz has called for tougher sanctions. And Donald Trump, never one to miss an opportunity to criticize his successor, has been tweeting about how he would crush Venezuela if he were still in office. The White House knows this. And in an election year, when every decision is scrutinized for its political impact, the temptation to look tough is overwhelming. That's why the US response to Venezuela's provocation wasn't just about sending a message to Maduro. It was about sending a message to the American we're not weak. We're still in charge. But here's the when foreign policy becomes a political tool, it stops being about strategy and starts being about optics. The US didn't just respond to Venezuela's provocation, it overreacted, because overreacting plays well with the base. And that's dangerous. Because when you're dealing with great powers like China and Russia, overreaction can lead to miscalculation. And miscalculation can lead to war. There's another domestic factor at play: the oil lobby. ExxonMobil has a lot riding on Guyana's offshore reserves, and the Comey has been lobbying hard for U.S. intervention in the Essequibo dispute. The Biden administration has been under pressure from both sides: Republicans who want to see Maduro gone, and oil Comeys that want to protect their investments. The result? A foreign policy that's being pulled in multiple directions, with no clear strategy beyond "don't look weak." This is how empires make mistakes. Not because they're evil, but because they're distracted. Because they're trying to please too many constituencies at once. And because, in the end, they're more concerned with looking strong than with being smart. Scenario: what happens next? So where do we go from here? Let's game out the possibilities, because the next few months could determine whether this crisis fizzles out or escalates into something far more dangerous. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela back down from the brink. The NITSA completes its patrol, the Venezuelan Navy returns to port, and both sides declare victory. The US imposes new sanctions on Venezuela, but stops short of military action. Maduro, realizing he's overplayed his hand, dials back the rhetoric and focuses on domestic stability. China and Russia, seeing that the US is still willing to enforce its red lines, decide not to push further for now. This is the most likely outcome, but it's not a good one. Because even if the crisis de-escalates, the underlying tensions remain. Venezuela is still a failed state with powerful allies. China is still extending its influence in Latin America. And the US is still struggling to maintain its hegemony in a multipolar world. The best-case scenario isn't a resolution, it's a temporary truce. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. In this scenario, the standoff continues, but at a lower intensity. The US maintains a naval presence in the Caribbean, conducting regular patrols to deter further Venezuelan provocations. Maduro, unwilling to back down completely, continues to harass commercial vessels in the disputed zone, but stops short of another direct confrontation. The US responds with targeted sanctions, freezing the assets of Venezuelan officials and cutting off access to the global financial system. This is the most dangerous scenario, because it's a slow-burn crisis. Neither side wants war, but neither side is willing to back down. The result is a prolonged standoff, with the constant risk of miscalculation. One wrong move: a Venezuelan patrol boat firing a warning shot, a US destroyer colliding with a civilian vessel, and the situation could spiral out of control. Scenario 3, the worst-case outcome. In this scenario, the crisis escalates into direct conflict. Venezuela, emboldened by Chinese and Russian support, attempts to seize control of the Essequibo region by force. The US, facing pressure from hawks in Congress and the oil lobby, responds with airstrikes against Venezuelan military targets. Russia, true to its word, sends volunteers to fight alongside the Venezuelan military. China, while not directly involved, provides economic and diplomatic support to Caracas. This is the nightmare scenario. A proxy war in Latin America, with the US fighting Russia and China by proxy. The risk of escalation is enormous. If a US aircraft is shot down, or if Russian mercenaries are killed, the pressure for direct intervention will be overwhelming. And once the shooting starts, it's hard to stop. None of these scenarios are good. But the worst-case outcome is the one we should be most worried about, because it's the one that could drag the US into another forever war, this time, in its own backyard. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Now, what most people don't realize is that this crisis isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the death of an entire geopolitical order. The liberal hegemony that the US has maintained since the end of the Cold War is unraveling, and the Essequibo dispute is just one of the many fault lines where that collapse is playing out. The establishment narrative, endlessly repeated in think tank reports and cable news ls, is that the US must respond to Venezuelan aggression with overwhelming force, lest it lose credibility. But this is a dangerous oversimplification. Credibility isn't built on reckless escalation, it's built on strategic patience and the willingness to accept short-term losses for long-term stability. The problem is that the US foreign policy elite has forgotten how to do that. Let me explain why this matters. The last time the US faced a direct challenge to its naval dominance in the Western Hemisphere was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Back then, the Kennedy administration had a clear red: Soviet missiles in Cuba were unacceptable. But even in that moment of existential tension, the US avoided direct military confrontation. Instead, it relied on a naval blockade, a quarantine, in the administration's careful wording and back-channel diplomacy to de-escalate. The crisis was resolved because both sides understood the stakes and were willing to make concessions. Today, that kind of restraint is in short supply. The uncomfortable truth is that the US no longer has the luxury of unilateral dominance. The world has changed. In 1962, the US accounted for nearly 40% of global GDP. Today, that number is closer to 25%, and China is rapidly closing the gap. The US Navy is still the most powerful in the world, but it's stretched thin. The Pacific Fleet is focused on containing China in the South China Sea. The Atlantic Fleet is dealing with Russian submarine activity near NATO's northern flank. And now, the Southern Command is being forced to divert resources to the Caribbean to counter Venezuela. This isn't a sign of strength, it's a sign of overstretch. Here's the Venezuela isn't acting alone. Maduro's regime is a client state of Russia and China, and both powers have a vested interest in seeing the US bogged down in a protracted crisis in its own hemisphere. Russia, in particular, has been explicit about its support for Venezuela. In 2019, Moscow sent 2 nuclear-capable Tu-160 bombers to Caracas as a show of force. In 2020, it deployed military advisors to help prop up Maduro's regime. And in 2023, it signed a new defense cooperation agreement with Venezuela, pledging to provide all necessary assistance in the event of a US intervention. China, meanwhile, has been more subtle but no less committed. It's Venezuela's largest creditor, holding over $60 billion in debt. It's also the country's largest trading partner, buying nearly half of Venezuela's oil exports. Beijing has no interest in seeing Maduro fall, because a US-backed government in Caracas would mean the loss of a key ally in Latin America. So what does this mean for the US? It means that any military response to Venezuela will have to account for the possibility of Russian and Chinese involvement. And that's where things get complicated. The US has spent the last 2 decades fighting asymmetric wars in the Middle East, where the enemy was a non-state actor with no air force, no navy, and no nuclear weapons. Venezuela is different. It may be a weak state, but it's backed by 2 of the world's most powerful militaries. A direct confrontation with Venezuela could quickly escalate into a proxy war with Russia and China, and that's a fight the US doesn't want to have, not in Latin America, not when its primary strategic focus is the Indo-Pacific. This brings me to the real: what is the US trying to achieve in Venezuela? The establishment narrative is that the US must restore democracy and protect its interests in the region. But that's a fantasy. The US has been trying to oust Maduro for years, and it's failed every time. The 2019 coup attempt, led by Juan Guaidó, collapsed when the military refused to defect. The 2020 sanctions, which were supposed to cripple the regime, only strengthened Maduro's grip on power by forcing him to rely more heavily on Russia and China. The 2023 oil sanctions, which were supposed to starve the regime of revenue, backfired when Venezuela found new buyers in India and China. The truth is that Maduro is more entrenched than ever, and the US has no viable path to regime change. So if regime change is off the table, what's left? The answer is containment. The US needs to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere, at least not in the short term, and focus on limiting his ability to project power. That means maintaining a naval presence in the Caribbean to deter further provocations. It means working with regional allies like Brazil and Colombia to isolate Venezuela diplomatically. And it means using targeted sanctions to weaken the regime's inner circle without punishing the Venezuelan people. But most importantly, it means avoiding the trap of escalation. The US can't afford to get dragged into another forever war, especially not in its own backyard. Here's the hard: containment requires patience, and patience is in short supply in Washington. The hawks in Congress are already calling for a military response. The oil lobby is pushing for airstrikes to protect its investments in Guyana. And the media is framing this as a test of US resolve. But resolve isn't measured in bombs and missiles. It's measured in the ability to outlast your adversary. The US won the Cold War not because it was the most aggressive, but because it was the most patient. It's time to relearn that lesson. The broader geopolitical implications of this crisis are even more troubling. The US is facing a world where its adversaries are increasingly willing to challenge its dominance in its own hemisphere. Russia is extending its influence in Latin America, from Cuba to Nicaragua to Venezuela. China is using its economic leverage to pull countries like Brazil and Argentina into its orbit. And the US is struggling to respond. The Monroe Doctrine, which once declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to foreign powers, is effectively dead. The question now is whether the US can adapt to a world where it no longer enjoys unchallenged hegemony. The answer will depend on whether Washington can break free from the failed policies of the past. The US can't keep treating every crisis as an opportunity for regime change. It can't keep relying on sanctions that don't work. And it can't keep assuming that military force is the answer to every problem. What it needs is a grand strategy that recognizes the limits of American power and the realities of a multipolar world. That means accepting that some adversaries, like Maduro, can't be removed. It means working with allies to contain threats rather than trying to eliminate them. And it means focusing on the long game rather than the short-term headlines. The Venezuela crisis is a wake-up call. The US is no longer the sole superpower, and the world is no longer willing to accept its dominance. The question is whether the US can adapt to that reality or whether it will keep making the same mistakes, until one of them finally leads to disaster. Now, what most people don't realize is that this crisis isn't just about Maduro's bluster or Guyana's oil fields, it's a stress test for Venezuela's own political survival. The regime in Caracas has spent the last decade perfecting the art of externalizing its failures. Every time the economy collapses, every time the lights go out, every time another Venezuelan flees the country, the government points to the US and its sanctions as the culprit. It's a tried and true playbook, one that Chavismo has relied on since Hugo Chavez first took power in 1999. But this time, the script is wearing thin. Let me explain why this matters. Maduro's decision to escalate with Guyana isn't just about distracting from domestic woes, though that's certainly part of it. It's about consolidating power in a way that leaves no room for dissent. The Venezuelan military, long the backbone of the regime, is fracturing. Not in the way Washington hopes, with generals defecting en masse, but in quieter, more dangerous ways. The top brass, men like Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez and Strategic Operational Commander Domingo Hernandez Larez, are still loyal, but the mid-ranking officers are restless. The reason? They're not just soldiers, they're businessmen. The military controls everything from food imports to gold mining, and sanctions have made their cut of the pie smaller. When you're used to skimming millions from state contracts, a 90% drop in oil production hits your bottom line hard. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro knows he can't afford a mutiny. So he's doing what all weak leaders do when their grip slips: he's manufacturing a crisis to rally the troops. The referendum on Guyana's Essequibo region wasn't just a propaganda stunt, it was a loyalty test. The military was ordered to mobilize, to show strength, to prove they still answer to the regime. And for now, it's working. The generals have fallen in line, at least publicly. But that doesn't mean they're happy about it. The real question is what happens then if the US calls Maduro's bluff and deploys naval assets to the region. The regime will have to decide whether to back down or double down. Backing down would be a humiliation, one that could embolden the very officers Maduro fears. Doubling down, on the other hand, risks a confrontation that Venezuela can't win. The Venezuelan Navy is a shadow of what it once was. Its flagship, the Mariscal Sucre, is a 40-year-old frigate that spends more time in dry dock than at sea. Its submarines are relics from the Cold War, and its air force is grounded by a lack of spare parts. Against the U.S. Fourth Fleet, it's not a fight, it's a surrender waiting to happen. But here's where things get complicated. Maduro isn't stupid. He knows he can't win a conventional war with the U.S. So if he's escalating, it's because he's betting on something that the US won't actually pull the trigger. He's counting on the fact that Washington is too distracted by Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East to open a third front in South America. He's gambling that the oil lobby's calls for airstrikes will be drowned out by the voices of restraint in the Pentagon and State Department. And most of all, he's betting that the US public won't tolerate another war, especially not one that looks like a repeat of Iraq or Afghanistan. That's a risky bet, but it's not an irrational one. The US has a long history of overestimating its ability to shape outcomes in Latin America. Remember the Bay of Pigs? The Contra War? The 2002 coup attempt against Chavez? All of them ended in failure, and all of them left the US looking weaker than before. Maduro is counting on history repeating itself. But there's another factor at play here, one that gets far less the role of Venezuela's opposition. For years, the US has pinned its hopes on figures like Juan Guaidó, the self-declared interim president who was recognized by Washington and its allies in 2019. The problem? Guaidó's moment has passed. His approval ratings have collapsed, his coalition has splintered, and his international support has evaporated. The European Union no longer recognizes him as Venezuela's legitimate leader, and even the US has quietly downgraded its engagement with him. The opposition is in disarray, and Maduro knows it. This is where the domestic political dimensions of this crisis become critical. If Maduro can survive this latest round of pressure, he'll emerge stronger than ever. A successful defense of the Essequibo, even if it's just a propaganda victory, would allow him to claim that he's standing up to imperialism. It would give him a pretext to crack down on dissent, to purge the military of disloyal elements, and to consolidate power ahead of the 2024 presidential election. And make no Maduro is running in that election. He's already rewriting the rules to ensure he wins, just as he did in 2018 when he banned the most popular opposition candidates and stuffed the Electoral Council with loyalists. The US has a choice to make. It can continue to treat Venezuela as a problem to be solved through sanctions and regime change, or it can accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere and start thinking about how to manage him. The first approach has failed for 2 decades. The second approach would require something Washington isn't very good patience. Let me be clear. I'm not saying the US should recognize Maduro or lift sanctions tomorrow. But it should recognize that the current strategy isn't working. Sanctions have devastated Venezuela's economy, but they haven't toppled the regime. If anything, they've made Maduro more entrenched. The US needs to stop pretending that there's a quick fix to this crisis. There isn't. What it needs instead is a long-term strategy that focuses on 3: containment, engagement, and deterrence. Containment means working with allies like Brazil and Colombia to limit Venezuela's ability to destabilize the region. Engagement means finding ways to talk to Maduro not because he deserves it, but because diplomacy is the only way to avoid a catastrophic miscalculation. And deterrence means making it clear that while the US won't start a war with Venezuela, it will respond decisively if Venezuela starts one with Guyana. The alternative is a slow-motion disaster. If Maduro feels cornered, he'll lash out. He'll deepen ties with Russia and China. He'll sell more oil to Iran. He'll allow Russian mercenaries to operate in Venezuela, just as they do in Africa. And he'll keep testing US resolve, not because he wants a war, but because he thinks he can win without one. That's the real danger here. Not that Maduro will sink a US warship, but that he'll miscalculate and force the US to respond in a way that neither side wants. The last time that happened in Latin America was the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're a long way from that, but the parallels are worth considering. In 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other time in history. The reason it didn't happen? Because both sides blinked. Because Kennedy and Khrushchev found a way to step back from the brink. That's the lesson Washington needs to relearn. Brinkmanship is a dangerous game, and Maduro is playing it with a weak hand. The US doesn't need to match his bluff. It needs to call it. Not with bombs, but with a strategy that recognizes the limits of power and the realities of a world where the US is no longer the only player on the board. The question is whether anyone in Washington is listening.